Looks like everybody's more or less turned on there. Missing some people from Health Center. Looks like Post is more or less away. Hoka is all there. Congratulations to Hoka. Can everybody hear me out there? Raise your hand if you can hear me. If you can't hear me, stand on your head. I figured that's a safe one, right? If they can't hear me, then they won't. Okay. There goes some more. People went down to Oka. Okay. I think last class we left off, we were talking about immigration, talking about our increasing population, and we talked about people coming over from Ireland because of what? Why were they coming from Ireland? What was the big problem in Ireland?
The potato famine.
Anybody in Post know what the big problem in Ireland was? They're having a blight of red hair. So, Hoka, somebody tell me what the problem in Ireland was. Somebody. Hello? Is your microphone working? There you go.
The potato famine.
Yes, ma'am.
That was a joke.
Giant blight wiped out the potato crop. There were other issues too. The British didn't treat the Irish people there very well, and life was pretty stark, and they started pouring out of that country like mad. Now over in Germany, we started getting a lot of Germans coming over too. They weren't coming for the same reason. They didn't have a potato blight or anything. This was a big revolution of the common people against the aristocrats who were running the Holy Roman Empire. It wasn't really Germany yet. It was getting to be Germany. And the aristocrats are going to win that fight because they've got the army under their control. And a lot of people come pouring out of Germany to keep from suffering retribution at the hands of the army, and a lot of them came to America. They're a little bit different from the Irish. One similarity was that they came in family units the same way the Irish tended to come in. They probably had a little bit more money than the Irish. Probably not quite as desperate as the Irish. There are other places they could go besides America. Some of them went to England. And they also, there was one real big difference. The Irish tended to go to the big cities looking for work. The Germans tended to go to rural areas because they didn't want to be in the big city anymore. That's where the revolutions all occurred. So in each case, the Irish are getting away from where they were having bad times on the farm. The Germans were getting away from the bad times they were having in the cities. And they're going to settle in rural areas outside some of our larger cities, but far enough out to be rural and get into things like dairy farming, small farming, brewing of beer, that sort of thing. Some of them made it as far down as Texas eventually. Both the Irish and the Germans will play a pretty major role during the Civil War. A lot of them will enlist in the military because that's a quick job. Probably not the most pleasant job. Okay. I put on the slides pictures of people that you should know. I don't know why. John C. Calhoun, we all know. Let me put that up for you. It's not up. Come on, machine. Function. Still not functioning. This came in early just to make it work, and then it stopped working. That's a painting of the German Revolution. They call those Germans, by the way, the 48ers. I don't know who called them that. I guess the Americans called them that. John C. Calhoun was one of the people that we talk about throughout this whole period of time. We've already talked about him a lot. Henry Clay, the American System and the Great Compromiser. Daniel Webster served as Secretary of State a couple of times. Great constitutional lawyer. Not really good at balancing his books sometimes. Roger B. Taney, who is the sitting Chief Justice of the United States. He got that job. Can anybody remember who gave him the job? He got it for doing some dirty work for a particular president. What did he do?
Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, it was Andrew Jackson was the president. And Andrew Jackson is the one that wanted the money taken out of the National Bank and put in the pet banks, and Roger B. Taney got that done. So that was his reward. We'll see him in a while, again. Labor, developments in labor. We're going to talk a little bit about some social issues. One was labor. There's a court case to remember. It's called Commonwealth versus Hunt. That shouldn't be hard to remember. It was in the Massachusetts Supreme, but the real formal name of it, it's still that way, is the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. The judge was Lemuel Shaw, and up until this time, up until 1842, there was a law about conspiracy, meaning if you got together, you teamed up together and planned to do something. I guess it was supposed to be something evil, but it was all in the eyes of the beholder. You could be charged with conspiracy. And a lot of people that were planning labor actions, like going on strike, were charged with conspiracy. Some of them actually did jail time, had to pay big fines, lost their ability to get a job in their trade of choice. Until Commonwealth versus Hunt, in which the court held it's not a conspiracy unless you're planning to do something that's patently illegal. So you can be planning to go on strike or planning to demand higher wages, any sort of thing, unless you're doing something that's illegal, it's not a conspiracy. This opened the way for labor unions. Now there's a whole bunch of them, and I'm not going to waste a lot of time talking about them. There are a lot of labor unions that wanted to say they were on a national level, but they weren't very, very strong. And the only things they tended to argue about was a set work week. First they argued about a 10-hour work day, and then they put it down to an 8-hour work day, things like that. But the thing is, we're about to get in a civil war, and during the times of the Civil War, people started forgetting about labor unions for a while because they had other concerns. After the Civil War, the unions will come back a lot stronger. Okay, having to do with labor, one of the biggest labor groups, it wasn't a union, it was part of the Democratic Party. It was the labor wing, or the radical wing of the Democratic Party. They call them the Locofocos. And the reason they call them the Locofocos is because that was the name of a large non-safety kitchen match. So why did they call them the Locofocos? Well, the tendency was wherever they met, the landlords didn't like labor, and the landlords would cut off the gas, and later on when they had electricity, cut off the electricity to disrupt their meetings. And so usually they finished their meetings up by striking matches to find their way out of the building. And after a while, people making fun of them started calling them the Locofocos, named after that brand of matches. Another group was the Democratic Party machine in New York, and it was called Tammany Hall. And Tammany Hall was very, very powerful. The bosses in Tammany Hall were probably as powerful as the mayor of New York and the elected New York government. A lot of times they controlled judges. A lot of times there was corruption. If you wanted a license to build something or do something, you could go to Tammany Hall instead of applying for it in the correct way, give them a little bit of money, and they could fix it for you. Very powerful. They tended, by the way, to be the people that met the new Irish immigrants who were showing up, because they'd offer them jobs and a place to live and things like that, all in exchange for political support. You can look at these slides about organized labor. I'm not going to talk about them. There were some groups like the National Trades Union. But as soon as we had the Panic of 1837, nobody's going to want to unionize very much, even though it becomes more or less legal in 1842. And the next big kind of social thing to talk about in the early 1800s is the Second Great Awakening. And it's very similar to the First Great Awakening. It's a feeling of people that they're drifting too far away from the church. And you get a lot of evangelists, and a lot of them kind of spout fire from their mouths when they talk. It's fiery preachers. Probably the most famous was Charles Grandison Finney, Presbyterian preacher. You see on that map a red area right in the middle of the map. That's upstate New York. And they called that the burnt over district because there were a lot of these fire and brimstone preachers there. And the joke was that they burned out the whole place with their fiery rhetoric. This spread all over the country, though. It wasn't just in New York, but it seemed like a lot of, I don't want to say revolution, but a lot of new religious and social movements come out of the same area. New England, in general, upstate New York, maybe even more specifically. Utopians and other people. One group was led by a fellow named Joseph Smith. He published a book called the Book of Mormon in 1830 as a complement to the Christian Bible. He called his church the Church of Christ. He developed a giant following, even in Europe. This is known in Europe, and people actually came over to America and joined this group. The group's going to become socially unpopular in the general area where they're founded because they started adopting some practices that local people didn't like, such as polygamy. They're going to move from place to place, trying to find a comfortable place to stop where people aren't all against them. They'll end up in Ohio for a while, then they'll go to Missouri, then they'll come back to Illinois, they'll found a town called Nauvoo. They'll have internal strife. They have a lot of pressure on them from the outside. People just don't want them there when they move in. And that develops pressure from the inside. And the church is going to split. There's going to be some violence. Some of the church members feel they should almost organize like a military to respond to the violence from outside. Some don't believe in that. The church is going to split into different fragments. The main fragment is going to change its name in the 1830s to the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. Eventually, in the 1840s, Joseph Smith is going to be killed in Carthage, Illinois. I think he'd been arrested. I think he was in a jail as a result of some of the internal fighting. And now the church will have a new leader after some infighting to determine who, in fact, was the new leader. And it will be a fellow named Brigham Young. That's that city in Illinois, Nauvoo. Brigham Young, in the 1840s, about 1847, is going to hear of a place out west, a valley, that's in such a deserted place that no one would bother them. And he's going to start organizing a movement in that direction. I mean, a physical movement. They'll organize almost like military units. They organize in companies. and they're gonna walk all the way to what we now know as Utah. It's called the Mormon Trail. It follows kind of what the Oregon Trail followed, partway anyway, up through Nebraska and Wyoming. But then it will turn south down to the area, the general area of the Great Salt Lake. They'll also keep on going to the west coast, but the majority of them will stop in that territory that we now call Utah. They'll settle that city beginning in 1847. This is the area that they initially claimed in the United States. Obviously, they're not going to get all of that, but that's what they're claiming. And it was pretty empty territory in large part. So there weren't too many people at the beginning to dispute their claims. The problem with polygamy is going to cause them a lot of trouble with local communities and also with the government. And eventually they will be persecuted by the federal government for their beliefs. And after many years of pressure, they'll give up on that practice for the most part. Another group, a much less significant group in terms of its lasting ability, were the Shakers. They call themselves the United Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. They were led by a woman named Ann Lee, and they felt that God had a dual personality, Christ and Mother Ann. They had some interesting beliefs. They started in New York, moved to Ohio, over to Kentucky. Once again, they're another group that kind of stands out, and a lot of people don't like them, so they're always kind of looking for a home. They're probably their strongest in 1830 to 1860, 30-year period. They believe, and this is where the shaking comes in, that religious fervor is a sign of heavenly inspiration. They also believed in celibacy, which may explain why they didn't last that long. And I'm always interested in these movements. I mean, you can have a religious movement, but no matter what you believe, you have to feed yourself. And they started out marketing things like garden, seed, herbs. They tried making clothing, and they finally settled into making furniture. And if you can find, and there's still in existence, Shaker furniture out there, if you can find it, it's worth a lot of money. But eventually they're going to die off. Another group, kind of semi-religious as well, called the Oneida community. You may recognize that name. Oneida is actually a place in New York. John Humphrey Noyes will found this group up in Vermont. These can move down to New York. They believe a little bit differently than the Shakers. They believe in true conversion. They believe that you can reach a state of perfection where you no longer have any sin. I've always wondered about that. I wondered if that means once I become perfect, I can do anything I want and it's not a sin? Or does that mean once I become perfect, I can't sin? I don't have to worry about it. I'm never going to get to be perfect. They believed in free love. They believed in universal marriage. Nowadays, you'd call that less politely wife swapping, or conversely, husband swapping. How'd they feed themselves? Well, early on, they made traps, animal traps, during the heyday of the fur industry. Then they're going to start silk culture, which involves growing mulberry trees and the whole 9 yards there. Then they started when we had canning, which happened in the later 1800s. They're going to can fruit. And finally, they're going to start making tableware. In fact, that may be why you recognize the name Oneida. If you go into Walmart or Target or even Dillard's, any of these places, and look for tableware, you're pretty sure to find Oneida tableware. I don't want to spoil it for you, they sold their name about 20 years ago, and it's probably Chinese made now, but for years and years and years, they provided high quality tableware. They're actually going to incorporate, but they had a lot of internal strife about whose children were whose children and things like that, and they tried to raise their children communally, and it didn't work out all that well. So eventually, their focus is going to be on how they feed themselves and not on any particular religious beliefs. Now over in Indiana, there was a place for 2 years, that's how long this movement lasted, called New Harmony. Robert Owen was a Welshman, I think, came over from England. He was a factory owner over in England, and he didn't like the way other factories treated their employees. And when he told people about it, they didn't like it very much. So basically, he looked for a place to come where he could have the perfect factory in the perfect factory community. He moves over to Indiana with 900 colonists. It's kind of an effort to have a utopian society where the factory provides schools for the children and babysitters and medical help and all that sort of thing. But basically they went broke after 2 years. The sad story of socialism. Then there was this special place up in Massachusetts called Brook Farm. This was formed by a bunch of people, we'll talk about them in a minute, called transcendentalists. And they wanted to take all the big minds of the time, all the brainy people, put them together and let them kind of sit around and think. And let them have a community in which everyone pulled his own weight and everyone had his own job to do and that sort of thing. Their slogan was high thinking, plain living. One thing they did have was a great school. I mean, you can imagine people like Nathaniel Hawthorne, famous writers, famous poets, highly educated people teaching in this little community school. People from the outside started wanting to send their kids to that school. That's probably the remainder of Brook Farm. Was the school lasted a lot longer than Brook Farm did. But eventually they started arguing because some of their members got involved with socialism, what you call utopian socialism. And it got to the point of anarchy, and a lot of the people didn't like the flavor of that, and they just wandered away. 2 words I bet you didn't think you were going to learn in history. Romanticism. In Europe, and it's going to filter over to America. We've been going through an age of reason, science, rational thinking. Like, I think, therefore I am, that sort of thing. And suddenly, some people are starting to say, you can't explain everything. It's not possible to explain everything. And this turns into a revolt against the world of scientific rationalism. And the leader of this, although it wasn't an organization or anything, was a German fellow named Immanuel Kant, who wrote a critique of pure reason. And his whole idea was, there are some things we know from intuition that we can't prove rationally. And if you sit and think for a while, there's a lot of things that you really, really know that you can't prove. And that was his whole argument. There's some things we know because we know it. Now Americans, because we always have to put a new twist on things, when Romanticism gets to America, we're going to put a twist on it. Some of our really, really highly educated people that probably didn't have enough to do, they didn't have to work in the farm fields or anything, we're going to come up with a version of Romanticism that they call transcendentalism, with an emphasis on things that transcend the limits of reason. Now, since these are super well-educated people, they're going to take things like the Europeans and Immanuel Kant's thinking. They're going to mix that with their New England Puritanism, that's already a mess, and some mysticism they're learning because some of them are studying about things in the Far East. Buddhism, Sufism, etc. Don't worry about it. Transcendentalists didn't really know what a transcendentalist was either, but you need to remember that it's just puts emphasis on things that transcend the limits of reason. Some of the early people were Unitarian preachers. George Ripley, James Clark, happened to run the Harvard School of Divinity, by the way. Theodore Parker, all highly educated people. George Ripley was involved with Brook Farm, by the way. But the ones to really remember are three names. I want you to remember these three names. One is Margaret Fuller. She died a young woman. She died in her 40s now. I know, you guys all think that's old. You'll get there fast enough and then you'll be thinking the other way. Those of you who aren't, extinguished by your parents because you didn't do your homework. She was a journalist and a critic. That didn't sound like much. There's a lot of journalists and critics out. Not female, not in her time in society. She was a transcendentalist. She was the very first American female book reviewer in American public journalism. And she wrote a book called Women in the 19th Century, which was considered to be the first major U.S. feminist work. Margaret Fuller. She campaigned for women's rights, racial equality, things of that nature as well. It would be interesting to know how she would have developed had she not died at the age of 40. The two big men involved in this were two poet essayists. One was Ralph Waldo Emerson, hardline abolitionist. They call him the high priest of transcendentalism. He wrote a work called The American Scholar. He wrote another work called Self-Reliance. And he believed in nonconformism. And born a few years later than Ralph Waldo Emerson was a fellow you should really remember, and his name was Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau took this nonconformism a step further. By the way, he considered not paying his taxes nonconformism. His family had to bail him out a few times. But he said some really remarkable things. He wrote a book called Walden, or Life in the Woods, about nonconformism. He said, if a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. And we hear that all the time. Usually it's kind of a offhand remark. He's marching to a different drummer, or something like that. But that's nonconformism in his expression. The other thing he believed in was civil disobedience. Now this is really important because this is a form of rebellion that doesn't, in theory, doesn't involve violence. And his statement about civil disobedience is simple. If a law is of such a nature that it requires you to be an agent of injustice to another, then I say, break the law. Don't be unjust to another. Why do I make such a big deal of this? I make a big deal of this because many, many people have studied the thoughts of Thoreau, including some pretty big names. For example, Abraham Lincoln. For example, the man whose name is on a street in almost every city in the United States.
Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther King Jr. But more significant even than those gentlemen is the fact that he's being read overseas. And probably one of the most famous practitioners of civil disobedience in the history of mankind was the Indian independence leader Mohandas Gandhi, the Mahatma. He believed in what Henry David Thoreau said. He read Thoreau. Why is this important to you and me? Because here you're seeing evidence, early evidence in our history, that suddenly people are starting to pay attention to what we think and do. instead of us always copying other people in the world. Now some of the world is looking at the Americans and thinking, this is something new, this is something of value. It will happen politically many years later. It will happen scientifically. It's already happening at this period of time, but it will really jump into action after the American Civil War. But here it is thought. American thought is being exported. Other transcendentalists, famous names, all in the arts. Nathaniel Hawthorne. I'm trying to think of some books he read well. The House of Seven Gables. Emily Dickinson, who wrote poetry with no punctuation and no capitalization, who, after her adventures as being one of the early women to go to a university, basically confined herself to her room for the rest of her life. She corresponded with people on the outside, she just didn't go out into public. Herman Melville, probably most famous for writing about internal psychological conflicts inside a person. His most famous book was about the great white whale and Captain Ahab, Moby Dick. You usually have to read that before you get out of high school, or at least excerpts of it. Edgar Allan Poe. Everybody knows something about Edgar Allan Poe. He believed in the macabre. He believed in kind of the dark side of things a little bit. He wrote some interesting things like The Telltale Heart. He wrote a really, really famous poem after which a U.S. football team is named. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary, the raven. Yeah. He also did something that a lot of poets hadn't done yet. He wrote his poetry a little bit in terms of rhythm and repetition, almost like music, like a particular form of music, a staccato kind of rhythm, lots of repetition. One of the ones that's the best example of that is the bells. And he just keeps doing the bells, 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 the tintinnabulation of the bells. And he used something called onomatopoeia, which means using words that sound like what they are. What kind of music? I call him a forerunner in a particular kind of modern music. Can you think of a kind of modern music like that? Really modern? Rap. Rap. Here's a man that's writing poetry with that repetitive beat and strong beat, and using words that sound like what they're supposed to mean. Then you had Walt Whitman, kind of a real free spirit. If there was anyone that was a little bit of an individualist, Walt Whitman was. He wrote some famous works. He was also an anti-slave person. He believed in women's rights, but he didn't like the organizations that supported it. He just believed in the principle. He got in trouble a lot because some of his poetry was a little bit too sensuous for the times. Nowadays, you wouldn't even think twice about it. One particular book, a full book of a single poem, was called The Leaves of Grass. He will get involved as a nurse in the Civil War. Go figure. There's Emily Dickinson, one of my favorites. A narrow fellow in the grass occasionally rides. You may have met him, have you not? She's writing about a snake. A narrow fellow in the grass, she called him. There's a Walt Whitman. Served as a journalist, teacher, government clerk, volunteer nurse. Okay, another big development is in the press, in the printed particularly news. We developed a press called the Napier Press. That was a hand crank press, but it can be actually powered by steam, and once we started using steam power for really large operations, that can be steam powered. After the Napier press, we come up with the whole rotary press. Hey, I think I'll put that in the test. It's a good question. What is the whole rotary? That thing could also be steam powered. I think the man that built this actually started out building steam engines for ships and somehow developed this press. All this means is we're moving from being able to print maybe 20 sheets an hour or something like that to being able to print 20,000 sheets in an hour, and suddenly newspapers become very cheap. Now, to have a press, that was very expensive. Once you had the press, you could turn out newspapers with a very low overhead. And so you start getting 1 penny a piece newspapers. I wouldn't mind going back to that. Maybe they could sell their newspapers. I don't know how many thousand tons of paper they waste and gets thrown away because nobody buys their papers, the newsstand anymore. Literacy in America, pretty high compared to the rest of the world. But we had no state school systems. I put in your readings. It'll come up in Unit 9. I don't think you can see them yet. It's there, I just haven't turned it on. About one particular man who starts arguing that the government should be starting schools up. Up in New England, lots of schools, more or less public, but they're all run by the churches. Down in South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, they didn't have many schools at all. You were either homeschooled or they sent you away. If they were rich, they sent you to Europe to go to school. If you were poor or not quite so rich, they'd send you to New England. There's the man himself, Horace Mann. He believed in a statewide school system. He believed having public schools bred social stability and equal opportunity. He also believed in normal schools. What's a normal school? Don't tell me it's not one that's the same as all the others. What is a normal school? Anybody know? 2 generations before you, everybody used that term. They don't use it anymore. It's a teacher's school. Because what we were doing is, the only qualification you needed to teach sometimes was if you could read and write. So the quality of education was really varied depending on the location. He believes in a statewide school system, and eventually he will start a statewide school system as Massachusetts' first superintendent of schools. Higher education, what do we have? Well, before all of this, we have Harvard, William and Mary, Yale, King's College, becomes Columbia later, College of New Jersey, becomes Princeton later, Academy of Pennsylvania, later on becomes University of Pennsylvania, Rhode Island College, later becomes Brown, Queens College of New Jersey, later becomes Rutgers. If you look down the list, you'll notice something very similar, and I should have it up after Harvard too. They're all started by churches. And most of the colleges in this period of time focused a lot on religious teaching. That will morph slowly but surely, and they'll move towards science and things of that nature. New institutions in the 1800s, U.S. Military Academy, 1802, UVA, 1817, Amherst, 1821, Oberlin, 1833, Mount Holyoke Women's College at first, 1837, and the U.S. Navy Academy in 1845. Some of the reformers. Temperance. What's temperance all about? The appropriate use of alcoholic beverages and such. In 1810, we had a population of 7.2 million people. We had, for a population of 7.2 million people, we had 14,000 distilleries, and we turned out 25 million gallons per annum. When I'm talking population, I'm talking about men, women, and children. That's a lot of booze made. 1826, we're going to start an American Society for Promotion of Temperance. People walked around with wearing a big T on their shirts. Doesn't mean they wanted to cut off alcohol, it meant they wanted it to be regulated. 1836, Massachusetts will pass the first law controlling liquor, when it could be sold, to whom it could be sold. And we're already in 1855, only 13 out of 31 states had liquor laws. Long way to go. Cure of the insane, and you've got a reading about this lady, Dorothea Dix, who made a thing about this. She also visited prisons and things of that nature. If you were rich, what did you do if you had a totally insane person in your family? You probably locked them in the back room of the house where people couldn't see them. You might even have to chain them to something to keep them from hurting themselves. She made a point of researching this. She went over to England at one stage, came back. They'd had some more advanced laws about this. And her description of how insane people were kept in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chains, naked, beaten with rods, lashed into obedience. She spoke before a number of different states' legislatures. She spoke before the U.S. Congress. And she actually gets some of the states to take action about this. She's also appointed superintendent of nurses during the Civil War. So she was interested in nursing. By the way, the nurses hated her because she was really, really strict. But she nearly worked herself to death doing that job. She thought the government should play a direct active role in social welfare. Women's rights. Here's some things that we're going to talk about. In fact, you may have a question or two about this on quiz 9. Women's rights. Believe it or not, in say 1840, women weren't screaming about the vote. What did women want? They wanted their own property rights because of a principle in law up until that time called coverture. They also argued for political participation. They wanted all the political rights that a man had. They wanted to vote. But the first thing was property rights. Whole bunch of ladies talking about their rights. And men as well, arguing on their behalf. Probably the first most famous were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. They're going to organize a meeting in 1848 at Seneca Falls, New York, arguing for women's property rights, and they'll actually get a law passed in New York taking away coverture. Let me explain coverture. Do I have it on there? There it is. Coverture is the notion that when a woman gets married, all of her rights are subsumed to her husband's rights. So she had no further rights to own her own property. She had no rights to sign a contract. Not to mention things like voting and all that. They call them a femme covert. An unmarried woman had the right to own property and make contracts in her own name. Coverture arose from the legal fiction that a husband and wife became one person when they were married. One nice thing about it for some women is that if you were in your husband's presence and you committed a crime, you couldn't be held guilty for it because it was your husband's responsibility. I wonder if that includes cutting your husband's throat. Now, I always wondered why more husbands didn't get murdered during this period of history, because once you were single again, you had property rights. At any rate, after the Seneca Falls Conference, women in New York are going to get property rights, and from state to state to state, this coverture is going to fade away. They still don't have the vote. Let's set the slides and keep right on moving. This is going to be kind of a tough few weeks for you guys. We've got a lot of things to do, and you got to keep up. You'll notice and you'll start crying about it right away. I know everybody gets Thanksgiving week off, except for us fine people here. I still have classes on Thanksgiving week, except Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday I don't have classes, but on Monday I have classes. And I will hold a class, and I will record it. And even if you're living out in Never Never Land, you're still responsible for watching that recording. And I will put up a quiz that's going to be due on that Monday. Don't cry about it. You still feed your dog during Thanksgiving week. You can feed your mind too. It's probably more important than the dog. So we talked about the reformers and coverture. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. What's the elephant in the room? Slavery. A lot of people tippy-toed around this subject, didn't want to talk about it, in the North and the South. I always started out with that picture of a slave from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. His overseer whipped him until he was permanently scarred like that. People always ask the question, if there's so many slaves in the South, why didn't they rise up, kill the white people, and be free?
Because they were afraid.
There's a lot of reasons. First of all, when they first came to America, they didn't have a common language. They couldn't speak English, and they couldn't speak each other's languages because they came from different parts of Africa. We tend to think of Africa like a giant country. It's a continent. There's lots and lots of countries there. I lived in one little country called Zambia. They had 35 different languages in that country. And generally the national language was whatever language the current president spoke. So it jumps back and forth. They didn't have common religious beliefs until gradually a lot of them became Christianized. So it took a long time before they started developing a more or less common language. And they could start cooperating. That doesn't mean that they didn't rise up. They rose up any number of times in the 1700s. And in the 1800s, you get some slaves who had more exposure to the outside world, who became educated. Either they were educated by their owners, or they educated themselves by absorbing what they saw. I name on this map here, let me put it up for you, 4 of the most important ones. What we call Gabriel's Rebellion. Gabriel Prosser was a slave who was well educated. Why? Because he'd been trained to be a blacksmith, and his owner lent him out to people. So he traveled by himself through town, through Richmond, Virginia, to get to other people's farms. And a lot of times when he did a good job, and he was very good at what he did, he'd get money on the side that he could put in his own pocket, aside from the money he had to take back to his master. And he could stop off and buy a beer and talk to people, and there were plenty of free people of African origin there, ship's crewmen and all sorts of people of that nature, and he could learn about things like the Haitian slave rebellion, all sorts of things like that. Gabriel and friends were talking about bringing their complaints about their situation to the governor of Virginia. But to outsiders, it sounded like some kind of violent rebellion that was being planned. And finally, one of the members of this discussion became afraid, and he went and told his owner what was going on. And Gabriel's co-conspirators were all rounded up, found guilty of various crimes, and executed. They'll eventually catch Gabriel as well. That's in the early 1800s. 1811, probably the largest in size, in terms of size, was the New Orleans Rebellion, sometimes called the German Coast Rebellion, because that's an area along the Gulf Coast of New Orleans. It was a bunch of slaves who simultaneously just put their tools down, then thought about it again and picked their tools back up, but went on strike, and they decided they were going to march up to New Orleans. And the group grew. And there were a few white people killed along the way, not many, but there was up to maybe 500 people marching down the road. And that scared a lot of the people on the farms down there until they called out the militia and all that, and they put this rebellion down really, really violently, killing a lot of the people involved in the march. And then, just wherever they spotted a slave that didn't seem to be with anybody, they'd go after after them at random. So who knows how many hundred slaves were killed. And pretty viciously, heads chopped off, heads stuck up on fence posts as a warning, that sort of thing. Then in 1822, a free African American by the name of Denmark Vesey gets the idea, if we can get on ships and sail away, all we have to do is get down to Spanish territory and we're free. So they decided to start a big fire in Charleston, South Carolina, to get everybody looking at the fire. Then they were going to run and steal ships and get out of there. But they got caught. Each time there's a rebellion, they make more and more laws to control the slaves. Right at the turn of the century, right at 1800, there were state legislatures, including Virginia, who were actually considering freeing all of the slaves. But then they became more and more defensive, and the controls on, there were laws passed, for example, making it illegal to teach a slave to read and write, making it illegal to allow slaves to have their own separate churches, making it illegal to allow slaves to carry guns. Finally, Nat Turner's rebellion was pretty violent in 1831. We'll talk about that a little later. All of these people were out of time. All these people were against slavery, but most of them didn't do a whole lot about it. What time is it really? Yeah, we're out of time. So we'll carry on with this and finish the section of notes next class. You will notice on your quizzes that when you turn the quiz on and start the quiz, it will only show you one question. You have to answer that question and then it'll show you the next question. It's not broken, that's just how it's working. So just answer the question.
Your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
Just hit that little arrow and it'll jump to the next question. Once you answer a question, it won't let you go back.
It won't let you go back.
No.